So we're continuing on this week with Albert Camus' book The Rebel, and he's established what it is that he feels one needs to rebel against and what the rebel actually is, and then looked at some of the, I suppose, the philosophical underpinnings for this rebellion, and then he's moved on to a bit of a historical review of some of the famous rebellions, and looked last week at what he called the regicides, particularly looking at the French Revolution where they actually killed the king. And this week moves on to what he calls the deicides, where they, I suppose, kill God. So with the king killers, I mean, this is this is my comment now, not Camus, but obviously a lot of kings have been killed throughout history. It's almost been normal, almost the normal succession for a king to be followed by someone who kills him and takes his place. And that's, of course, been done not necessarily for any particular metaphysical reasons, but more just out of ambition, I suppose. And that's a familiar aspect of the history of the world. And the other interesting thing is that a bit over 100 years before the French Revolution, which is the one that we're all familiar with, the English, of course, killed their king. And that was perhaps for a different reason. It was partly to establish some sort of democracy, and also to maintain, well, they believed they were maintaining a kind of religious purity. So there have been many ways of kings, reasons why kings have been killed. Anyway, so to get back to Camus, he now is going on to what he calls the deicides, and he particularly goes back to look at again Hegel, that was mentioned a couple of weeks ago. And Hegel seems to be a lot more radical than Rousseau, that we mentioned last week. Rousseau gave some of the philosophical basis for the French Revolution in Camus' mind. Rousseau maintained that the contract that the people have with a ruler, which had been based on a king who apparently received his authority from God, that was no longer valid, but now the people accepted direction and guidance from rulers because they were acting in the name of reason, which was the expression of nature. And that apparently was what the French Revolution was based on, according to Rousseau, to Camus and other people. But now Hegel goes much further than that. And again, this is what Camus is saying in his book. Reason is not a good enough foundation for anything, because reason is not static or is not confirmed. It might change. and the French Revolution was based on the will of the people, on human beings, but man is not a fixed entity. He might change. So the whole idea with Hegel is that everything's in a kind of a state of flux and everything's evolving. So man changes, reason changes, justice changes. At some future date we might look back, or people might look back then and see, well, what the people back in the 18th century or the 21st century considered to be reason and just is quite different from what the people now at the end of time consider to be just and reasonable. And Hegel actually said that there will come an end of time when we will know what the absolute truth is, but we're a long way from that, and we're evolving towards that. And I guess we hear this term, the Hegelian dialectic. It's talked about a lot, I think. But what that really means, basically, is just a series of compromises moving forward, or at least moving in some direction, moving from one place towards another place. We don't quite know where that final place is or what it will be, but that movement is achieved by a series of compromises. So basically there's a proposition, something that we think is right. That's what's called the thesis, which we generally accept as being probably true. And then opposed to that is something quite different, the antithesis. And then somewhere in between we come to a compromise or a synthesis where we sort of come to a meeting ground somewhere between those two things. And that synthesis then becomes the new thesis for another step, the next step forward. So having moved on to that, what was the synthesis is now the new thesis. We then still have the antithesis, and then we make another synthesis part way between those two, and that's another compromise. So everything is evolving, Hegel says. We're all moving step by this process of dialectic towards some ultimate goal, or maybe it never will be an ultimate goal, but everything's changing. So there's this whole process of evolution. And this all happened, he was talking in the beginning of the 19th century, so that's, 60 or 70 years maybe before Darwin, I'm not sure exactly. So we often think of evolution as being a biological theory, particularly came out of Darwin and a few other people that were working on the same thing at the same time, and that by studying animals and plants and living organisms, the way they've changed over time, one has arrived at this theory of evolution, which means that gradually things have happened by a process of change and working things out. And that was a biological idea, but in fact Hegel was talking about this from a theoretical point of view decades before that. So I wonder, again, this is me saying this now, not Camus saying it, did Darwin come to his theory just from observing living organisms, or was he in fact aware of Hegel's idea, and was he seeking to find some cases in the living world to support Hegel's theory, perhaps, so that evolution was initially an intellectual idea, and that Darwin and the others were seeking to find some justification for it by looking at the living world. So I'm not sure about that. Anyway, the point is that, getting back to Hegel, he was saying, no, Rousseau was wrong. The will of the people are not always right, or necessarily continuing to be right. Just a reason, which Rousseau said was the expression of nature, may not be right, or it might be right for a time, but it won't always be right because it's going to change. Everything's going to change. And so we don't know where it's going to end. And then I'm not sure where the idea of a deicide comes into this. I suppose Hegel is saying, well, even our idea of who God is subject to evolution and flux and change. So what we think of God now, we won't think of God in the future. Camus doesn't actually spell that out, although he calls this section the deicides. But he has also mentioned before the idea that, even in the French Revolution, people had put aside the idea of God and said, we're going to, our authority comes from something else now, and Hegel's taking that a step further. But the other point that Camus is making now is that if having set aside God as the reason for the social contract, as the reason for the regulation of society and what we believe is just and true, he comes back again to what he was talking about before in some of the earlier chapters, getting back to Meursault in The Outsider and the dilemma that was proposed in the book, The Myth of Sisyphus. This meaningless of life, if we no longer have God as a meaning, there's nothing after this life, we come back to this absurd, meaningless pointlessness of our existence. Again, so that's really where Camus started from. That's the starting point for this whole investigation, really. And so in this chapter he says, well, if we've done that, and he's leading up to where a totalitarian regime comes from, if we have God and we believe that God is there and he's with us, then he's seeing us, he knows us, and that's all we really need, because if I know that God regards me, cares for me, sees me, that gives my whole life meaning. I really don't need anything other than that. Just to know that God sees me is more than sufficient for me to have purpose and fulfillment in my life. But then Camus saying, and perhaps he's saying that Hegel is saying, and other people are saying, well, we haven't got that anymore. We've chosen to put that to one side. So what meaning is there to our life now? And so we have to find something, some meaning, and we can do that by getting the regard of other people. If other people can look at me and say, this person, myself, is someone that's important to them, and they're going to listen to what I say, look at what I do, read my books, care about what my thoughts are, then that will give me some meaning because other people are valuing what I'm saying. And the more people I can get to regard me and listen to me and perhaps follow me, the greater is my meaning. And so I need to get more and more people to pay attention to me and to follow me. And the final end of that will be if everyone is following me, if I can dominate the whole world or the whole of my country or maybe the whole world ultimately, and everyone will be listening to me, regarding my words as truth and obeying me and following me, then I will have a complete validation in myself, I suppose. And so that leads eventually to, I guess, a totalitarian domination in a world government. And so Camus saying, well, Hegel's ideas will lead us to that. And I think he's probably right. And again, from his position in the middle of the 20th century, they just finished the Second World War, the USSR was still in full swing. That was what was happening. But again, I'm not sure, we talked about this last week, Camus has pointed out this position and this inevitable result of the thoughts that he's talking about. But does he think that's a good thing? I'm not sure if he's actually condemning it or not. So we're still at that position. Anyway, that's where we've got to in the argument so far.